So in the last section, we looked at the fact that you can assign functions to things. You can assign them to variables, put them in arrays, put them in other data structures like objects. In this section, we want to look at the fact that you can pass functions into other functions. After all, you can pass numbers to functions. You can pass strings to functions. Why can't you pass functions to functions? You can. And then we'll look at some other points in the next sections. All right, so I'm in the same Firebug environment as in the previous example. So I already have a function called square. And I already have a function called double. So now let's make a new function that takes a function as an argument. Function call it. And the first thing that you pass to it will be a function. The second thing you pass to it will be a value that that function that you pass in expects. And then it will return, take the function you pass in, call it on the value you pass in, and return that result. Take the function you pass in, call it on the value, and then return it. Sounds reasonable. We better try it. So I'll do call it. And I'll say I'll pass in the square function, and I'll pass in 7. Inside call it, it will then call square on 7 and return the result. If I pass in double instead of square, I get out 14. Now, in this case, there's not a whole lot of advantage unless you compute what that function is. You don't know ahead of time what the function is. You just do some logic to decide which function you're going to call. For example, you have some data and you don't know which way you're going to process the image using technique 1 or technique 2. You figure that at runtime, but technique 1 and technique 2 are stored as functions. You pass them in. We saw the similar idea with the sort method of the array. It expects a sorting function. You can pass in the one to tell it how to do the comparisons. Okay, let's give a slightly more complicated example. Let's say function operate, and it'll take a function, we'll just call it f this time, and I'll make some numbers. 1, 2, 3 in an array, and then I'll make a loop for var I equals 0. We've seen this many times. I is less than nums.length. I plus loop down the array the same way you did in the previous examples. And now I'll call the function on that array element. So I'll say var num equals nums sub I. So that'll be the array element. So the first time around, that value will be 1, the next time 2, the next time 3, and so forth. And then I will just print out the result. Console.log operation on placeholder is placeholder. And I will say num and f of num. So it'll say the operation on 1 is, and then it'll call the function on it and see what you get. Okay, and now let's try this. Let's say operate on that array with square. And you'll say, aha, if I do the operation on 1, I get 1. If I do the operation on 2, I get 4. If I do the operation on 3, I get 9. But if I operate on the same array using double, it'll say, oh, the operation on 1 is 2, the operation on 2 is 4, the operation on 3 is 6. So it's just a little more explicit version of what I did in the previous example. Pass in a function and call it on something inside the other function. So you can pass numbers to functions. You can pass strings to functions. In JavaScript, functions are first-class data types, so you can also pass functions to functions.